This is AWANI Global with me, Nailah Huda, and on this week's episode of AWANI Global, we want to first look at the United Nations 80th General Assembly, or UNGA, which just took place last week, marked by a general mood of frustration and disappointment over protracted conflicts from Ukraine to Gaza. And while efforts to put an end to these conflicts may have fallen flat, what did get a lot of attention were the delegates walking out of the hall in protest as the Israeli leader Netanyahu made his address. And this comes at a time of the growing wave of recognition of the Palestinian state by more and more Western countries as of late. And of course, the global Sumud flotilla, which at the time of recording, as of today on Wednesday, is nearing dangerous waters and is recently joined by military warships sent by Spain, Italy and Turkey. But we want to discuss how consequential these events are and whether these events would amount to real, much-needed change in bringing immediate relief to civilians in Gaza and ultimately put an end to the genocide. And so to unpack some of these key questions, we have joining us in the studio Professor Salim T. Professor of Anthropology from Hofstra University of the United States, and a more familiar face to Astro, of course, Associate Professor Dr. Roy Anthony Rogers, Head Department of International and Strategic Studies of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences of University Malaya. Thank you so much, Professor Salim and Prof. Roy, for joining us today on AWANI Global. If it's all right, I'd like to start with you, Dr. Roy. If we look at the United Nations General Assembly and just the overall perception of the UN right now, we're hearing a lot from critics saying that UN is facing this crisis of confidence with issues of funding, mistrust from major powers, issues of reforms, and what we're seeing with the General Assembly. Do you think there's much change? There's much change, or there's much efforts to address these concerns? And do you think the UN is still fit for purpose?
All right. Firstly, let me express my sincere thanks to Astro AWANI for the kind invitation. Yes, no doubt that the United Nations, having been in existence for 8 decades, since 1945 till now, there are a lot of frustrations, especially pertaining on issues related to, if I may term, high politics or security issues. Obviously, the Security Council, very much being influenced by the veto powers, and these veto powers, they have used their privilege for their own national interests. So there's no doubt that there are cases, one of them, for example, the issue of Gaza that has been ongoing all this while. Yes, no doubt, we always cite October 7, but bear in mind the occupation on Gaza, on Palestine, has been there for since the late 40s itself. So we should not just look from October 7, but even before that, the occupation has been there for such a long time. So the frustration has been there, mounting for such a long time. So, but at the same time, to be fair to the United Nations, there are areas that are which may be on low politics, like on social, such as on education, childcare. There have been some achievements, I must say. For example, some of its agencies like UNESCO, UNICEF, even in the issue of healthcare, they have achieved some, brought some goodness to humanity. But on the issues related to high politics or geopolitics, there's a lot of frustration. So coming back to the question that you have raised, that I believe that we want reforms, and this is what has been highlighted by almost most speakers who have spoken during the UNGA, including Malaysia's Foreign Minister, Datuk Mat Hassan. He has been very strong in his message this year and even last year, and the year before last, by the Prime Minister himself, Datuk Seri Anwar Ibrahim, about calling for reforms within the United Nations. I'll stop there, we can discuss further.
Yeah, of course. President Donald Trump, US President Donald Trump himself questioned the legitimacy of the UN in his address. This is, of course, nothing new, but what does this say about the state of the UN? Prof. Salim, maybe we can look at the US politics here and how perhaps President Trump is taking into account public perception, not just around the world, but in the US, of course, and how might the US future involvement in the UN look like?
Thank you as well for the invitation. I'm happy to be here and to respond to that. I think it's really important to think about the domestic situation in the U.S. because a lot of what President Trump said in the UN is reflecting his own political values for his base, which is a significant segment of the American population, but it's not the total population. His ideas about immigration, his critique about climate change, it's all it's all a scam. His critique about the lack of unity of European nations in terms of the Ukrainian war. I think all of that is reflecting his own political perspective and some segment of American society. But in relation to Palestine, I think there's a recent New York Times poll that states the majority of Americans are now of a different perspective from Trump, and they think that the economic and military aid should end. And that's been a major shift. New York Times, just in a recent article, stated from 2 years ago, it's a major shift in the outlooks and the perspectives of American citizens.
It's interesting you pointed out this shift in public perception. How might then this grow into this growing disconnect between how the American public are talking about the Palestinian issue and how it's being addressed by the nation's leaders, political leaders, by the mainstream media? Do you see this disconnect, and might that perhaps translate into growing discontentment?
Yeah, I think there's growing discontent. You can see back in early 2024, there were really intense protests going on across the United States, especially in university context, including my own university. There's a student group called Student Voices for Palestine, and it's a very diverse student group. There's students from all religious backgrounds in that. There's definitely a strong representation of Muslim students, but also there's Christian students, there are Sikh students, and there's some Jewish American students that were leaders of the organization, leading in the chants and very active in the protest. So I think there's a sense broadly in American society that it's a humanitarian issue, and I think people are beginning to look past the religious differences and the discourses to really look into the humanitarian disaster, because we're watching all of the videos, all the bombing, all the institutions getting destroyed. And so I think there is this disconnect between the position not only of the Trump administration, but also of the lawmakers, because it's very difficult for Democrats and Republicans to vote against continuing the funding of the Israeli government. I mean, it's been up, and there's been some Democrats that but a minority. So it's very strong, I think, amongst the political elite that Israel holds a very important geopolitical position in relationship to U.S. power in the Middle East.
I want to go back quickly to the UN General Assembly. Dr. Roy, talking about Israel and Palestine, of course, what did get the most attention were the act of by delegates walking out of the hall in protest as the Israeli leader Netanyahu made his speech. And he, among others, in his speech declared the Western's recognition of the Palestinian state as a mark of shame. Just your overall thoughts on this growing pressure against Israel, how it's been building up. Of course, the issue stems beyond October 7th, but since then we've seen this shift and this growing pressure now against Israel.
Yeah, is it news about the genocide that has been occurring in Gaza has been picked up by media in the West, and as we know that in the West, issues related to issues related to human rights, genocide, is a core issue. So, and those who go out to protest, whether it is in Paris, in London, in Dublin, or in other parts of Europe, they are not Muslims themselves. You see, they are Europeans, they may be Christians, or they may be atheists, or people comes from various backgrounds, because the issue today is not just a purely an Islamic issue, but it is an issue of humanitarian help. It's a humanitarian issue. So that's why there's mounting of pressure from the people themselves, from the grassroots, wanting certain things to be done, and the leaders, whether it's in London, Paris, they know very well if they do not act, they will become less popular. So this is also a matter of regime survival. Maybe they may still, deep in their hearts, they may have certain sympathy towards Israel, but for their regime survival, they have to do something to show their support for the suffering of the Palestinian people. So therefore, I believe European countries today, they choose to recognize Palestine is upon the interests of their own people, the pressure from their own people, because there have been numerous demonstrations. And these are, as I said, not done by migrants from South Asia or from the Middle East or from Southeast Asia, but these are their own nationals themselves. So therefore, there is this call from the Western countries. Of course, Netanyahu, he has to, protect his so-called his own interest by saying that it's a shame, but the fact remains that this is an humanitarian crisis already.
Yeah. You talk about this public perception, but if we were to look at the government's role in recognizing the Palestinian state, how do you think this would translate to real change for civilians in Gaza, civilians in Palestinian territories, if any?
Well, at least diplomatically, there is a recognition from these countries. I think that is a first move. In the past, they choose not to recognize Palestine. And we hope from that, there will be more initiative undertaken by the European countries. For example, now this flotilla from Spain that is moving towards Gaza. And those who participate in this flotilla are not purely Muslims per se. A lot are Spanish activists and American activists themselves. So this, I believe this is a first move, a positive move towards the recognition of Palestine, and this can provide some political pressure towards Israel.
Prof. Salim, just your thoughts on this wave of recognition of the Palestinian state, the symbolism of this act, and you mentioned how it ties into, of course, domestic politics in the US, in the American context, but just for Western countries as a whole, we're seeing in recent weeks the UK, Australia. How symbolic do you think this move is, taking into account domestic politics?
I think it's quite significant symbolically. But we have to look at it critically, because on the one hand, you have this increasing recognition. Of course, it was even going on for the last couple of years. But at the same time, you have this devastating destruction and humanitarian crisis.
It's still being funded by the same countries.
And it's still being funded. So, I mean, the recognition, especially of the need for a Palestinian state or some kind of solution. Some people say it should be a one-state solution where everyone has equal rights in Israel. Some scholars are saying there should be a no-state solution because states are part of the problem. But whatever the solution, I think it needs to be connected to what you noted in terms of the real-life conditions of Palestinians. And so we need to think, first of all, about stopping the violence. And then we need to think about rebuilding and think about bringing the refugees back, the right of return of refugees who in Lebanon or in Syria and so forth, and Jordan, and also the rights of returns of those who were displaced by the Nakba in 1948 to go back to their homes, and then to rebuild. I think that's a priority. So any kind of solution, whatever it is, a one, two-state or no state, needs to be connected to improving those conditions and dealing with those real-life issues.
Do you think that's being talked about enough, those terms?
I don't think they're being talked about enough. It's, very strongly absent from the New York Declaration that France and Saudi, before the UNGA negotiated and spoke about. It's absent from the Trump proposal, because these proposals, both of them, even the New York Declaration, are rather lopsided. They're really catering to Israeli interests, and they're not thinking about and really speaking to the real needs of the Palestinian masses.
Perhaps what's missing then is the voices of Palestinian people, and what's missing is that the legitimacy. And so how then do you think Palestinian voices should be centered in these talks, in these conversations, when their officials are not even being legitimized on an international level?
I think there needs to be a council of countries from the UN, to really move it out. There's a lot of support. Something like 143 nations, are voting to recognize Palestine and to increase and upgrade their status as an observer state in the UN. But I think that they need to bring in the voices. There needs to be a council of those nations really to intervene and to try to broker a real sort of settlement, a real proposal that brings in the voices and the concerns and the perspectives of Palestinians, because both of these proposals, New York Declaration and Trump's proposal, is sort of centering on the Palestinian Authority. And I mean, scholars have been writing for a long time that they're extremely unpopular with the Palestinian masses. And, their proposals are based on Hamas, Hamas free zone, turning over their weapons. Well, when there was an election in Gaza, they democratically elected Hamas in 2006. So their voices and concerns need to be looked at. I think they're colored so broadly as a terrorist organization by October 7th. But of course, they began in the 80s and 90s as a beneficent association, helping people out, providing for their needs. And because of the violence from the Israeli state, it's produced them. They were driven to move to violent sort of methods. So I think we have to think more broadly and historically that it's really the violence of occupation, the violence of secular colonialism that has produced these responses from Palestinian organizations.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to think about these labels that are being thrown around, painting them as terrorist organizations and whatnot. I think I just recently saw this event being held and organized by the CIA, where they spoke and held a panel session with the Syrian leader, who once was declared a terrorist, labeled by the US government. So it's really just interesting to see how fast these things and these labels change. But Dr. Roy, going back to this peace plan, as Prof. Salim mentioned, there's various mechanisms for peace, or attempts at least, and various solutions that's being proposed. And one of the recent ones being proposed by Trump himself, the so-called US peace plan for Gaza, that has been welcomed by European and Middle Eastern leaders. It does, among others, propose an immediate end to fighting, the release of Israeli hostages, and in exchange the release of hundreds of detained Palestinians. And Trump himself has, I'm not sure whether it was a warning or perhaps a threat to Hamas to accept it, or Israel otherwise will, quote, finish the job. How solid do you think is this peace plan? What are the potential pitfalls, do you think?
Well, how can you achieve a long-term peace with a threat? Isn't that an irony? This for me is very much like in the past, the gunboat diplomacy strategy is I threaten you to accept. So how can you achieve peace from something which is the origins of it is from a threat? You cannot have the fruit which is you want peace, but the root is from origins from a threat. So it won't work in that way. Yeah. So I think you have to address the root cause is, as I mentioned earlier on, the issue of occupation, the issue of colonization that has occurred for so many years, since 1948. That is the root cause. While you may have come up with some of this peace plan, it's like you put out fire in one, but you don't address the fire will come up from another side. You see, and above all, you impose threat to force people to accept it. So it is just for a short-term, short gap measure. It will ultimately come up with other forms of violence or respond. I think in long term, it may not necessarily work. You see, as I said, you start off something with a threat and you expect the fruit to be of harmony and peace. That is something very, very difficult to achieve.
Yeah. What then do you think could be the mechanism for real sustainable change? As Professor Salim mentioned, perhaps it's in a way of developing this council from the UN.
A council of that nature is very important, but let's go back to the basic. The earlier UN resolutions, it talks about two-state solution, or go back to the basic and the issue of occupation. I think until and unless that is settled, we will not have a long-term peace in West Asia. You were not able to achieve peace in Palestine. Yeah. So I think that we have to go back to the basic, and the UN resolutions that have been passed by the Security Council by itself, but constantly being violated again and again. The solution is already there. It's just a matter of enforcing it itself.
And of course, to add to this mix now, we have the global Sumut flotilla. Of course, all eyes are on the flotilla, a fleet of about 40, 50 vessels and ships now, and increasing support, more warships joining in. There is some dispute there as to how Italy is playing its role, but there is, other military warships from Spain and Turkey as well, and now nearing Gaza's waters. Professor Roy, how do you think this might be consequentially in the participation of military warships from other countries? How might it change the dynamic of this conflict?
As I earlier on mentioned, with the recognition of some of the European countries, at least now this flotilla is not just flotilla by NGOs themselves, but here they are being escorted by Spanish warship, perhaps even Italian warship. Now, the issue of if Italy really is sincere or serious to help, then will they ensure the safety of this flotilla? So with this recognition, diplomatic recognition, we are hopeful that the European countries will at least provide some form of assistance. Right? I'm not absolutely thinking that they will be able to resolve the issue, but at least compared to, say, 5 years ago, when this flotilla were to enter the waters in Palestine, there was no coverage or cover from the other countries' navy. So at least today there is some form of positive improvement. Yeah.
We are coming to the end of this discussion, but Professor Salim, I do just want to hear your thoughts on how, as we're seeing the sort of narrative around Israel being broken down slowly and growing more each day, the international community, we might see them singling out the depleting numbers of allies that Israel has now. How do you foresee the international community in the next few years as this conflict continues to play out, and how the US might eventually lose some of its allies on this? Do you see this as being a critical juncture?
I think that's the direction we're heading, that Israel and the US are becoming much more isolated on the international stage. And I think what we need is really to move from and be inspired more broadly by the citizens from across the world who are in the Sumut flotilla, going to challenge and putting their bodies and their lives on the line to challenge the blockade. And so I think hopefully in the next coming years there will be some kind of council that will be organized. But I think together with that there needs to be a peacekeeping force, because Israel is very violent, is very belligerent. I'm worried about the Sumut flotilla now. And the lives of the people on there, because they've been very aggressive. They've been bombing, countries throughout the region. So I think there needs to be a peacekeeping force along with that council to sort of negotiate whatever kind of solution. There needs to be some kind of intervention now of a peacekeeping force to force a peace, because Israel doesn't appear to be willing, to do it, and the U.S. is supporting them, even with, as you mentioned, the threat that if Hamas, Palestinians don't accept it, they're going to finish the job. I mean, what do you mean? Are they going to finish a genocide that the world has been looking at? And so hopefully there'll be some kind of council and there'll be some kind of a peacekeeping force to move towards a resolution.
Lastly, I do want to talk about something that you both pointed out, and I think it's quite important, about how this issue now cuts across religion, religious lines, definitely. And Professor Salim, I mean, you look into anthropology, you look into religion, and how do you think, how important do you think is it when we look at the framing of this conflict? And when we look after decades and decades, we look back in history books and how this has been sort of talked about, not just in mainstream media, but in public discourse as well. How important do you think is it for us to look at this beyond religious lines? Or perhaps maybe it is also important to talk about the religious context. I don't know.
I think it's important to think about the religious context, but also to think beyond that, because as Professor Rogers pointed out, it's a broader humanitarian issue. But I think in particular countries, the response of people was connected to their religious identities. And so for Muslims, of course, there's an automatic, very strong connection with the Holy Land and with the sacred mosques and so forth. I mean, it's that kind of connection. But I think it's broader now because people were seeing the extent of the genocide, right? And so I think earlier that people would respond, well, that's a religious struggle and it's been going on forever. It's going to continue forever. It's a primordial thing. But of course it's not, because a lot of Palestinians are also Christians. A lot of them are also Jews. Not a smaller number, but they had been living there in peace, right, for centuries before the plan, right, backed by European powers to establish this occupation, which Mr. Rogers spoke to. So I think that we need to, think about religion, but also expand it and think more broadly, because it is a broad humanitarian.
Do you think we talk enough about the colonial struggle of this, right?
That's right. We do need to think more about, the settler colonialism, that's involved with it, and the support from other settler colonialist states and colonialist states. And so I think that's part of the problem that we're still dealing with in terms of transforming and making those reforms within the UN that Mahd Hassan was talking about, because you still have this set of 5 countries, right, the permanent members of the UN Security Council that have the veto power. So when a resolution comes up for, to solve the issue, U.S., a settler colonial state that's been close to funding Israel, has a very close historic relationship, has vetoed it. They vetoed it last year. And so I think that's part of the colonial aftermath, because the UN was formed in 1945. I mean, it was still sort of a colonial, Second World War and so forth. So it still has that the vestiges of the imperialistic colonial era. And I think Mahd Hassan is right. It needs to be, the veto needs to be eliminated, and the UN needs to be reformed.
I mean, it goes all the way back, and there's, of course, a lot of layers to this. And I, of course, want to continue picking your brain on this, but that is all the time that we have. Perhaps that's for another session, for another day. Thank you so much once again to Professor Salim and Assistant Professor Dr. Roy for joining us today on AWANI Global. That is all AWANI Global this week with me, Nailah Huda. We'll catch you another time.